The young soldier leaned across the aisle, lifted his combat boot, and rested it on the old man's armrest like he owned the place. The soul stopped only a few inches from the man's hand. A few soldiers nearby laughed. One of them raised his phone and started recording. The old man looked down at the boot, then slowly folded his hands in his lap. He didn't complain. He didn't call the flight attendant. He didn't even look angry. That only made the young soldier smile wider. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" he said. "Can't take a joke?" The old man stared straight ahead. 15 minutes later, a colonel walked down the aisle, saw the man's face, and stopped so suddenly that the entire cabin seemed to go quiet. What happened next wiped the smile off every soldier's face. The old man's name was Thomas Whitmore. He was 72 years old, with silver hair, a neatly trimmed white beard, and the kind of tired eyes that made him look older than he really was. He wore a faded red jacket over a plain gray t-shirt. The jacket was clean, but the cuffs were worn, and one of the pockets had been stitched by hand. Thomas had owned it for more than 20 years. His daughter had offered to buy him a new one many times. He always gave her the same answer. "This one still works." That morning, Thomas had left Seattle before sunrise. He was flying to Virginia to visit his daughter and meet his newest granddaughter for the first time. He had chosen the cheapest ticket he could find. Middle seat. Back of the plane. No extra legroom. No priority boarding. Thomas didn't care. He had spent most of his life learning the difference between discomfort and hardship. A cramped seat was discomfort. A delayed flight was inconvenience. Thomas knew what real hardship looked like, and because of that, he rarely complained about anything. The gate area was already crowded when he arrived. Families stood over piles of luggage. Business travelers stared at their phones. Children ran between rows of chairs while tired parents tried to keep up. Then a group of young soldiers entered the terminal. There were 6 of them, all wearing uniforms, all carrying identical bags. They were loud, excited, and full of nervous energy. People noticed them immediately. Some smiled. A few nodded respectfully. One elderly woman quietly said, "Thank you for your service," as they passed. The soldiers thanked her, but once they reached the gate, they went right back to joking with one another. Thomas watched them from across the waiting area. They looked barely old enough to shave. One of them, a tall young man named Hernandez, seemed to be the center of the group. Every joke started with him, and every laugh came a little louder when he was around. Thomas recognized the behavior. Confidence stretched too far. Youth trying to look fearless. He had seen it many times before. He had probably been that young once too. When boarding began, Thomas waited until his group was called. He stepped onto the plane, found his row, and carefully lowered himself into the middle seat. His knees hurt more than they used to. His back stiffened if he sat too long. But he kept those things to himself. A young mother sat by the window, holding a sleeping baby against her chest. The aisle seat was still empty. Thomas placed his small bag beneath the seat in front of him and pulled his elbows close to his body so the mother would have more room. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "No problem." A few minutes later, the young soldiers entered the cabin. Their voices carried from row to row. Hernandez was still telling a story that made the others laugh. As luck would have it, the soldiers were seated around Thomas's row. 2 sat across the aisle. 3 were directly behind him. Hernandez took the aisle seat opposite Thomas. The last soldier sat a few rows farther back. At first, nothing happened. The plane pushed away from the gate. The flight attendants gave the safety demonstration. Thomas looked out past the sleeping baby and watched the runway disappear beneath them. For a few quiet minutes, he allowed himself to think about his daughter waiting in Virginia. She had sent him a picture of the baby the night before. Tiny hands, dark hair, a serious little face. Thomas had studied that picture longer than he wanted to admit. He had lost friends before they ever had the chance to become fathers. He had watched families grow older through photographs. Now, at 72, he was traveling across the country just to hold a child who carried a part of him into the future. That thought should have brought him peace. Instead, laughter erupted across the aisle. Hernandez was looking at him. One of the other soldiers leaned forward and whispered something. They both laughed again. Thomas pretended not to notice. He had learned a long time ago that not every insult deserved an answer. Sometimes silence was patience. Sometimes it was discipline. And sometimes it was armor. About 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign turned off. Hernandez stood and opened the overhead compartment. He took out a pair of headphones, but instead of returning directly to his seat, he stopped beside Thomas. "Hey, old-timer," he said. Thomas looked up. Hernandez nodded toward the cramped row. "You comfortable?" Thomas gave a small nod. "I'm fine." The answer was calm and polite. Hernandez glanced at his friends. They were already smiling. "Well, that's good," he said. "Mind if I get comfortable too?" Before Thomas could answer, Hernandez lifted his boot and placed it on the edge of Thomas's armrest. The dirty sole hovered beside Thomas's hand. The soldiers behind them burst out laughing. One of them pulled out his phone. "Classic Hernandez," he said while recording. The mother by the window opened her eyes. She looked at the boot, then at Thomas. Her expression tightened, but she was holding a baby and clearly didn't want a confrontation. Thomas slowly removed his arm from the armrest. He placed both hands in his lap. Hernandez looked down at him. "No problem, right, Grandpa?" Thomas's jaw tightened. For half a second, something changed in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, memory. Then it disappeared. "No problem," Thomas said quietly. Hernandez left his boot there for another few seconds, enjoying the attention. Then he lowered it and sat down. "Didn't think so." The soldiers laughed again. Thomas turned his face toward the seat in front of him. He could feel his hands beginning to tremble. He pressed them together until they stopped. The shaking wasn't caused by the young man. It came from somewhere much older. A jungle road, rain hitting leaves, mud pulling at his boots, a wounded soldier calling for his mother. Thomas closed his eyes. He breathed in slowly, then out. The past returned in flashes sometimes. He had learned not to fight it. Let it come. Let it pass. Return to the present. The cabin. The engine noise. The sleeping baby beside him. The red jacket across his chest. He was not back there. He was here. A flight attendant came down the aisle collecting empty cups. She noticed the uncomfortable silence around Thomas's row. Her eyes moved from Hernandez to Thomas, then to the phone in the other soldier's hand. "Everything all right here?" she asked. Thomas opened his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." The flight attendant hesitated. She seemed to know that wasn't the whole truth. Still, Thomas gave her a reassuring nod. She continued down the aisle. Across from him, Hernandez leaned back and pulled on his headphones. To him, the moment was already over. To Thomas, it had opened a door he had spent decades trying to keep closed. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in age spots and thin white scars. Hernandez had probably seen nothing but an old man in a cheap seat. He couldn't have known what those hands had carried. He couldn't have known how many letters they had written to grieving families. He couldn't have known how many young soldiers had once watched those same hands point toward a map while Thomas tried to bring them home alive. But Thomas didn't believe respect should depend on knowing someone's history. A person should not need medals to deserve basic decency. An old man should not need a heroic past before someone decided not to humiliate him. That was the part that hurt. Not the boot. Not the laughter. The belief that kindness had to be earned through importance. 30 minutes later, the plane began to shake. The seatbelt sign came on with a chime. A few passengers looked up nervously as the aircraft passed through a rough patch of air. The flight attendants returned to their seats. A man in a crisp military uniform stepped out from the first-class cabin and began walking toward the rear restroom. He looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. His hair was gray at the temples. Silver eagles rested on his shoulders. A colonel. The change among the young soldiers was immediate. Hernandez straightened in his seat. The soldier holding the phone lowered it. The joking stopped. The colonel moved down the aisle with the calm, controlled posture of someone who had spent years entering rooms where people watched his every move. He passed one row, then another. As he approached Thomas, the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. Thomas shifted in his seat. The collar of his t-shirt moved, and a thin metal chain slipped into view. Old dog tags rested against his chest. The colonel glanced at them. Then he kept walking. He made it 2 more steps. Something in his expression changed. He stopped. Slowly, he turned around. Thomas had already tucked the tags beneath his shirt, but the colonel continued staring at him. Not at the jacket, not at the gray hair, at his face. The colonel stepped closer. "Excuse me, sir." Thomas looked up. For the first time during the flight, he seemed surprised. The colonel studied him carefully. "Is your name Thomas Whitmore?" The young soldiers looked from the colonel to the old man. Thomas hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes." The colonel's face went still. "Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Whitmore?" Thomas glanced around the cabin. He clearly did not enjoy the attention. "I've been retired a long time." The colonel took a slow breath. Then, in the middle of the narrow airplane aisle, he brought his heels together. His back straightened. His right hand rose in a sharp, perfect salute. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it is an honor to see you again." Every sound in that section of the plane seemed to disappear. Thomas stared at him. Recognition slowly spread across his face. "Daniel?" The colonel smiled. "Yes, sir." Thomas raised his weathered hand and returned the salute. "At ease, Colonel." The colonel lowered his arm, but he did not move. Hernandez looked confused. His eyes moved toward the old man he had mocked only minutes earlier. The colonel turned toward the young soldiers. "Gentlemen, do you know who you've been sitting next to?" No one answered. Hernandez swallowed. The colonel looked directly at him. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Whitmore, retired." The soldiers stared. The colonel continued. "Long before any of you put on that uniform, he led men through some of the worst conditions a soldier can face. He carried wounded troops out of danger when he had every reason to save himself. Later, he trained officers who went on to command units all over the world." His voice softened. "I was one of them." Thomas lowered his eyes. "Daniel, that's enough." "No, sir," the colonel said. "Not this time." He looked back at the soldiers. "When I was a young officer, I cared too much about looking strong. I thought leadership meant being the loudest person in the room. Colonel Whitmore taught me that leadership is responsibility. It is sacrifice. It is doing the right thing when no one is watching and when no one will ever give you credit." Hernandez's face had lost all its color. The colonel's gaze shifted toward the phone in the other soldier's hand. "What were you recording?" The soldier froze. "Nothing, sir." The colonel held out his hand. "Show me." The soldier unlocked the phone and opened the video. For several seconds, the colonel watched Hernandez place his boot on Thomas's armrest. He watched the soldiers laugh. He heard the words, "Can't take a joke, Grandpa?" When the video ended, the colonel looked up. There was no anger in his face now. Something colder had replaced it. "Delete it." "Yes, sir." The soldier deleted the video. Recently deleted folder, too. The soldier's hands shook as he opened the folder and erased it permanently. The colonel turned to Hernandez. "Stand up." Hernandez immediately rose and snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "Did you put your boot on this man's armrest?" "Yes, sir." "Did you mock him while your friend recorded it?" Hernandez looked straight ahead. "Yes, sir." The colonel stepped closer. "Why?" Hernandez opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Finally, he said, "I thought it was funny, sir." "You thought humiliating an elderly passenger was funny?" "No, sir. I mean, yes, sir, at the time." The colonel's voice remained controlled. "And now?" "No, sir." "Because you found out who he is?" Hernandez did not answer. The colonel waited. Finally, Hernandez said, "Yes, sir, partly." That is the problem. The words were quiet, but they landed harder than a shout. You should not need to see medals before you show someone respect. You should not need to learn a man's rank before you treat him like a human being. Hernandez's eyes dropped. The colonel's tone sharpened. Eyes forward. Hernandez immediately obeyed. You are wearing the uniform of the United States Army. People see that uniform before they see you. Your behavior does not represent only your personality. It reflects on every soldier standing beside you and every soldier who came before you. Yes, sir. What you did was not strength. It was not confidence. It was not humor. It was a young man trying to make himself feel bigger by making someone else feel small. Hernandez's voice cracked. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. The colonel glanced at Thomas. Thomas had been silent the entire time. His hands were still folded in his lap. His expression showed no satisfaction, no victory, only sadness. Hernandez turned slightly toward him. Sir, I apologize. I didn't know who you were. Thomas looked up. That's not the apology you need to make. Hernandez blinked. Thomas slowly stood. The young mother moved her legs to give him room. His knees stiffened as he stepped into the aisle, but once he was standing, his posture changed. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away. He looked directly at Hernandez. You keep saying you didn't know who I was. Hernandez nodded. Yes, sir. Thomas's voice remained calm. You knew enough. The soldier looked confused. You knew I was an old man traveling alone. You knew I hadn't bothered you. You knew I was sitting quietly, trying to get through a flight like everyone else. Thomas paused. You didn't need to know anything more. Hernandez's eyes filled with shame. No, sir. Thomas glanced at the uniform. Do you understand what that means? The uniform, sir. Yes. Hernandez swallowed. It means I'm a soldier. Thomas shook his head. It means you belong to something bigger than yourself. The surrounding passengers listened without moving. That uniform carries the names of people you will never meet. Men and women who served with honor. People who came home injured. People who did not come home at all. Families who still set an empty place at the table. Thomas stepped closer. When you wear it, your actions speak for them too. Hernandez's face tightened. A tear slipped down his cheek, but he did not wipe it away. Thomas continued. You are young. Young people make mistakes. I made plenty. The colonel looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. But you need to learn something before someone puts lives in your hands. Thomas pointed toward the phone. Real strength is not getting a group of people to laugh at someone weaker than you. He placed his hand over his heart. Real strength is having power and choosing restraint. He pointed toward the sleeping baby. It is protecting people who cannot protect themselves. Then he nodded toward the other soldiers. It is correcting your friends when they are wrong, even when standing against them costs you something. The soldier who had recorded the video lowered his head. Thomas looked back at Hernandez. One day, you may be responsible for other soldiers. They will watch how you treat people, not how you behave during ceremonies, not what you say when senior officers are nearby. His voice grew firmer. They will watch what you do when you think no one important is looking. Hernandez struggled to speak. I understand, sir. No, Thomas said. You're beginning to understand. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to hear. Thomas's expression softened. The good news is that one bad moment does not have to define you. Hernandez finally looked at him. But what you do after that moment might. The young soldier nodded. Yes, sir. Thomas held his gaze. When you deploy, remember this. Yes, sir. When someone under your command makes a mistake, correct him without destroying him. Yes, sir. When civilians treat you with respect, earn it. Yes, sir. And someday, when you are the older man sitting quietly while younger people decide you no longer matter, remember how this felt. Hernandez's voice dropped to a whisper. I will, sir. Thomas studied him for another moment. Then he extended his hand. Hernandez stared at it. He had expected punishment. He had expected anger. He had not expected a second chance. He took Thomas's hand carefully. Thomas's grip was still strong. Serve well, Thomas said. Hernandez nodded as tears gathered in his eyes. I will. Come home safe. Yes, sir. The colonel cleared his throat and turned toward Thomas. Sir, I have a seat in first class. Thomas immediately shook his head. Daniel, don't start. I'm not asking. You're still stubborn. You trained me. A few passengers smiled. The tension in the cabin finally loosened. The colonel reached beneath the seat and picked up Thomas's small bag. You're taking my seat. I paid for this one. And I'm about to enjoy it. Thomas glanced at the young mother beside him. She smiled. Please go, she said. You deserve the space. Thomas gave her a tired smile. Everybody deserves the space. Then he looked at the colonel. All right, but only because my knees are killing me. The colonel smiled. Yes, sir. As Thomas moved toward the front of the plane, something unexpected happened. A man near the aisle stood and nodded. Then another passenger stood. An older woman placed her hand over her heart. A veteran, sitting several rows ahead, raised a quiet salute. Thomas looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he returned the salute. He did not walk like a celebrity. He walked like a tired father on his way to meet his granddaughter. The colonel helped him settle into the first-class window seat. He brought him water and a blanket. Before returning to coach, he leaned closer. Sir, I never got to thank you properly. Thomas looked at him. For what? For the day you stopped me from quitting. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he searched his memory. The colonel continued. I was 25. I had made a serious mistake during training. I thought my career was over. I came into your office ready to resign. Thomas slowly nodded. I remember. You tore up my letter. It was a bad letter. The colonel laughed softly. You told me that failure was expensive, so I had better learn enough from it to make the price worthwhile. That sounds like something I would say. It changed my life. The colonel's voice grew unsteady. You didn't excuse what I did. You made me face it. But you also refused to let my worst day become my entire identity. He glanced toward Coach. You just did the same thing for that young man. Thomas looked out the window at the clouds. Someone did it for me once. The colonel waited, but Thomas did not explain. After a moment, Thomas looked back at him. You turned out all right, Daniel. The colonel smiled. High praise from you, sir. I'm proud of you. The colonel's eyes glistened. He straightened and gave Thomas one final salute. Thomas returned it. When the colonel went back to coach, the young soldiers were silent. Hernandez sat with his hands resting on his knees. The colonel took the now empty middle seat beside the young mother. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then the soldier who had recorded the video leaned toward Hernandez. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have stopped you." Hernandez looked at him. "I would have laughed at you if you tried." "Probably." Hernandez nodded. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't have tried." The soldier deleted another copy of the video from the group chat. Then he opened a search page and began reading about military leadership, old battles, and the officers who had trained generations of soldiers. Hernandez stared at the aisle. The words Thomas had spoken kept repeating in his mind. What you do after that moment might define you. For the rest of the flight, he did not joke. He did not put on his headphones. He sat quietly and thought about the kind of soldier he had been pretending to be and the kind of man he still had time to become. When the plane landed in Virginia, passengers reached for their bags. Thomas remained seated until most of first class had cleared. The colonel returned and carried his bag despite Thomas's protests. As they entered the coach cabin, Hernandez and the other soldiers were standing in the aisle. They had formed a line. No one had ordered them to do it. As Thomas approached, Hernandez raised his hand in salute. The others followed. Thomas stopped in front of them. For a moment, he saw not the men they were, but the men they might become. He returned the salute. "Serve well," he said. The soldiers answered together. "Yes, sir." Thomas looked at Hernandez. "Remember." Hernandez nodded. "I will, sir." Thomas and the colonel continued up the jet bridge. Inside the terminal, Thomas's daughter was waiting near baggage claim. She spotted the red jacket first. Then she saw the colonel carrying her father's bag. People were still nodding to Thomas as he passed. She hurried toward him. "Dad?" Thomas smiled. His daughter wrapped her arms around him. For the first time that day, his shoulders relaxed. She stepped back and looked at the colonel. "What happened?" Thomas glanced at Daniel. The colonel smiled. "Your father gave a leadership lesson." Thomas shook his head. "Your father sat on a plane." His daughter knew him well enough not to push. She took his arm and led him toward the exit. "Your granddaughter is waiting." Thomas's face changed instantly. "Well, why are we standing around?" The colonel laughed. Before leaving, he shook Thomas's hand. "I'll call you. You officers always say that." "I mean it." Thomas held his gaze. "I know." The colonel disappeared into the crowd. As Thomas and his daughter walked toward the parking garage, she looked at him again. "Seriously, Dad, what happened?" Thomas shrugged. "A young man made a mistake. And he was given a chance to learn from it. That's all? That's enough." Months later, Hernandez would tell the story to a new group of soldiers. But he would not tell it as a story about a famous veteran being recognized. He would tell it as a story about the moment he realized respect should never depend on status. Years later, when he became a squad leader, one of his soldiers would make a humiliating mistake in front of the unit. Hernandez would remember Thomas. He would correct the soldier firmly. He would hold him accountable, but he would not destroy him. He would give him a path forward. The colonel kept his promise too. He called Thomas every few months. Sometimes they talked about the past. Most of the time, Thomas asked about Daniel's family, his soldiers, and whether he was still taking care of his knees. Thomas continued wearing the same faded red jacket. He still bought the cheapest plane tickets. He still avoided attention. And he still believed that the strongest people in the room were often the ones who had nothing to prove. Because honor is not a medal. It is not a rank. It is not a uniform, a title, or a story people tell after you are gone. Honor is what you do when you have the power to humiliate someone and choose kindness instead. It is what you do after you fail. It is how you treat the person who can do nothing for you. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room has survived battles you could never imagine. So before you judge someone by their age, their clothes, their seat on a plane, or the way they carry themselves, remember this. You may not know their rank. You may not know their history. You may not know what they have lost, what they have survived, or how many people are standing taller because they once chose to lead with courage. But you already know enough to treat them with respect.